Hello, listeners. Welcome to Ideas, Innovative Dialogues in Educational Approaches and Scholarship podcast series in the Research Hub at the Faculty of Education, Simon Fraser University. My name is Shaila and I'm your host. I would like to acknowledge that all Ideas podcasts are recorded at Simon Fraser University, whose three campuses are located on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coquitlam nations. Listeners, we are very happy to welcome Ngoc to this episode. Ngoc is a graduate from the Curriculum and Instruction Master's Program with a focus on equity studies in education. Her thesis describes Vietnamese students' experience of using English in Canadian postsecondary and social contexts from the lens of racialization, critical language and race theory, and raciolinguistic ideologies. The work aims to challenge the deficit narrative of Vietnamese students' English and promotes the respect and inclusion of different languages, cultures, and ways of making meaning in Canadian university. Ngoc also holds a master's in gender, sexuality, and women's studies from SFU. Her full bio is going to be made available on our webpage. Hello, Ngoc. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I have read about your work from our Faculty of Education newsletter. I don't know if it was a newsletter. I don't remember exactly, but I've read it somewhere. The news came to me through Faculty of Education, and I was fascinated by your work because it's just so important. So I would like to ask you more about your research. So could you please tell us more about your research, how you did your research? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So my research looks at Vietnamese student experience of using English in Canadian university, particularly from the lens of racializations, critical language and race theory, raciolinguistic ideologies. And in particular, I look at how the white standard English and the white native speaker ideologies inform the receptions of Vietnamese student English and how the participants respond to the ideologies.
That's very interesting, though. It brings to my second question. Why were you interested in this research topic?
I think is a confluence of two things. So it started off based on my experience as a former Vietnamese international student and my observations of other Vietnamese students as well on campus and off campus. And I noticed that at the one end of the spectrum of experience, our English is considered to be not up to standard. But at the other end of the spectrum, our English can be considered to be surprisingly good. But either way, the comment seems to be based on the perception that the Vietnamese student English in general is not good. And it got me curious and thinking about what good compared to what standard and good compared to whom. And it really got me to start thinking about the questions of English and the experience of English in Canadian university. And the second thing is that, and I noticed that there is an incredibly diverse demographics in university years. And I often think that we would welcome different ways of writing and of speaking English. And yet the reality seems to suggest that not all types of English are equally welcomed. And it makes me really wonder, why is that so? And it's really interesting to me. And I think that too, the combinations of personal experience, observations of others, and also, yeah, and the questions of diversity and how it actually played out in practice in the form of language using is what got me started on this topic.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing with us about what piqued your interest in this. And I think this is also a very timely topic. I really liked what you said that not all types of Englishes are welcome, but it should be, especially now that and we see that as you said, that SFU and the university demographics is very multilingual and multicultural. So it really is worth investigating why, even in this context, when we do say that we have a multilingual university, why not all Englishes are welcome and what does that mean? And I'm very happy that you took the initiative to investigate further, to explore more. So your topic, like I said, is super interesting. So can you please share with us uh, since you have looked at Vietnamese students' experiences. So can you please share with us what is students' experience like?
Yes, definitely. So one thing I found is that Vietnamese students' English is frequently devalued, both in speaking and writing, particularly when they speak. Their accent often makes them stand out and perceived as deficient English users. Their English, their written expressions can also be considered to be awkward, and they're considered the writing considered to have a Vietnamese accent and not up to academic standard. So people perceive their English to be lacking because the listeners compare Vietnamese student English to the dominant norm of standard English and the perceived skill of the native speaker. And some of the consequences of the deficient perceptions are that the Vietnamese students are excluded from group work in classroom, or they get interrupted or bypassed when it's their turn to speak. Um, and the deficient perception can also comes along with different stereotypes of the group as well, both in educational space and in social interactions, and showing them that not only as a very poor English users, but also as permanent foreigners in Canada, um, or unskilled non-Western researchers in Canadian university, or even as undesirable partner. So there is a kind of intersections between the perception of the language skills and other racial and sexual and immigrant stereotypes that impose on the group. And of course, the perceptions and the stereotype can make a student feel very non-belonged, undesirable, and intellectually underestimated, which I think is very unfortunate to have, like, particularly if we consider that as that is a type of experience that they received on in Canada. Um, but I also found that Vietnamese students can also internalize some of their hegemonic ideas about English as well. So some of them believe in the idea of standard English, and they do also perceive themselves as insufficient English speaker because they compare themselves to the very elusive idea of the native speaker as well.
Wow, I like that phrase, permanent foreigners. It says a lot. Those two words, they express a lot without saying much. And I think it kind of, you know, it catches the essence of what we're discussing here today very acutely and very comprehensively. So what you have mentioned is very interesting. And I also like what you said about students themselves internalizing the hegemony, the power imbalance, and looking for some sort of standard English, um, and trying to understand, trying to learn that variety of standard English, which is going to pass them probably as native speakers. Probably that's the goal, and it also leads to interesting questions such as why such ideologies are being internalized by these students. But I have another question for you here because um, your research was on international students and their goal of learning standardized native English. So, so in a university context, what are the implications for your research for teaching and learning academic English? Because we all know that when we enter university as students, we need to learn academic English. We need to familiarize ourselves with the norms and conventions of academic English. So, what is your opinion on this?
Thank you for the questions. Though I want to clarify myself a bit, is that my research looks at not only international student, but also domestic Vietnamese Canadian student as well. It is because I found that the deficient perceptions of Vietnamese student can be applied not only to international student, but also to the domestic one because of the perception of the racial marker and the ethnicity. So the questions, and I want to link that to your questions about the implication for academic English, is that um, if we want to strive for a more inclusive academic English, it is going to benefit not only international students, but also the domestic one as well. So I think to answer your questions, I think one of the implication is definitely to challenge the hegemonic norms and ideas of English in academic setting. So, for example, the pressure on the student to adopt standard norms or the pressure on them to copy the very elusive native speaker ideal, those are things that I think we need to get rid of. And the literatures show that both of these ideologies are deeply connected to the idea of finance and the idea of why secular citizenship in Canada as well. So there is a trouble links between the linguistic and racial ideologies. And I think for teachers, academic supporting staff, and even the student themselves, it means that we need to reflect critically on our own ideas of racial linguistic biases. Um, and, and I think the need to challenge the dominant academic English norms can be helpful because we don't want speaking in terms from the perspective of junior scholars from the global south coming to Canada to study at the PhD and graduate level. And we don't want to marginalize them further in Canadian university just because of the deficient perception of their English. Because in that case, the claim of English insufficiency can be used to discredit their knowledge and their ways of making meaning. And I think that is really unfortunate. Um, and I think it's all of that implications, I guess, when it comes to the questions of supporting student, I think it's really brings me to think about Hilary Chang's the access paradox. So we want the student to succeed now, and part of that is to help them to access the Y spec and to learn the dominant norms of English, right? But we also want to challenge the structure that makes a demand for the dominant norm exist in the first place to go away. And I think there are right now a lot of ongoing practices and pedagogies in university that actually can both give the student access to the norms and at the same time challenge the dominant hegemonic ideas about English. So, for example, in terms of reflective practice for pre-service teacher, so I read some research that they suggest to use autobiographical storytelling for the teacher to reflect on their personal raciolinguistic subjectivities and to raise awareness of the racial and multilingual justice. Or they can do a multilingual drama workshop where the teacher can engage in pedagogies that is very much rooted in the idea of multilingualism and translanguagings. Um, yeah, so that is some of the research that suggests that we do have in place some creative, reflective practices for teachers. And in terms of curriculum design for students, there is also a lot of exciting research as well. So, for example, I recall in the earlier um, um, episode of Ideas where you interview Pedro de Santos and Dr. Song, where they redesigned the curriculum from a very dynamic and pluralistic lens, where they use collaborative writing for students to learn that not only for them to help the student to understand that academic writing as a process is very collaborative and not only individualistic, but also like as in terms of the pedagogy, help them to get a very concrete sense of how to do exact step to reach the goal of academic writing that is required of them in their academic space. And yeah, and I think that is just some of the ideas, and I think and because my research doesn't really focus on that area, but there is such a broad literature out there, and people doing great work of challenging the hegemonic ideas of standard English, native speaker ideals, and but also still giving the student the step they need to be successful in university, and I think that's wonderful.
Well, thank you very much. And yeah, thanks for correcting me. Your research is not about is not only about international students, it's about both international and home students from Vietnamese background in Canada. Thanks for correcting that. And thank you very much for this really very comprehensive and insightful response on the implications of such research for the teaching and learning of academic English at university context. Um, I think you touched on some very interesting topics and timely topics as well. So you did talk about the theories, but you also mentioned what can be the practical strategies that can be used by teachers and learners in classrooms to promote teaching and learning that does challenge the hegemonic understanding of standardized native English or native variety of English. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me today, and um, I'm happy to be here and to share conversation with you. And also, I thank you for hosting the podcast. I learned a lot from the previous episodes. It's just always very interesting to hear from others from the faculty and from the faculties and other graduate students and their experience of doing English. Sorry, not doing English, but doing research. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to hear from you. And thank you for listening to Adia's podcast. So you have just added to the knowledge base that we are trying to create and share with others because we believe knowledge increases when shared. So thank you so much again for joining us. Listeners, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation and there's a lot of takeaway from this conversation as well. Thank you for supporting Ideas, for always being with Ideas. Please stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you all.